In the golden glow of the ancient world, where the lifeblood of civilization flowed endlessly through the desert, a legend was born along the banks of the mighty Nile River. This was a land of gods, pyramids, and power, ancient Egypt, and it was here that a young girl would rise to become one of the most fascinating rulers in history, Cleopatra VII. But Cleopatra was not born into peace. She was born into chaos. Around 69 BC, Cleopatra entered the world as a princess of the powerful Ptolemaic dynasty, a Greek ruling family that controlled Egypt after the death of Alexander the Great. Though they ruled Egypt, they were not truly Egyptian, and this created a kingdom filled with tension, ambition, and danger. From a young age, Cleopatra was different. While other royals indulged in luxury, she immersed herself in knowledge. She studied languages, philosophy, politics, and science. Unlike her predecessors, she learned to speak the language of her people, something that made her both respected and feared. Cleopatra wasn't just preparing to be a queen. She was preparing to survive, because in her family, survival was never guaranteed. The royal court was a nest of betrayal. Brothers fought sisters, allies became enemies overnight, and power was often seized through exile or worse, death. Cleopatra watched, learned, and waited. She understood one thing very clearly. The throne of Egypt was not inherited, it was taken. When her father, King Ptolemy XII, died, Cleopatra was thrust into a dangerous game of power. At just 18 years old, she was expected to co-rule Egypt with her younger brother, who was also her husband, according to royal tradition. But sharing power was never truly an option. The tension between them grew quickly. Advisors whispered, enemies plotted, and soon Cleopatra found herself outmaneuvered, betrayed, and forced into exile, cast out of the very kingdom she was destined to rule. But exile did not break her. It transformed her. In the harsh deserts beyond Egypt, Cleopatra began to plan her return. She gathered allies, built her strategy, and prepared for a bold comeback. She wasn't just fighting for a throne anymore. She was fighting for her legacy. And this was only the beginning. Because the young girl born along the Nile was about to step onto the world stage, where her intelligence, ambition, and charm would capture the attention of powerful men, mighty empires, and history itself. The rise of Cleopatra had begun. Exiled, hunted, and betrayed, most would have faded into history. But not Cleopatra VII. In the scorching deserts beyond ancient Egypt, Cleopatra was not defeated. She was evolving. With every passing day, her determination hardened. She knew that reclaiming her throne would require more than strength. It would demand strategy, courage, and the right ally. And then, fate intervened. To the north, a storm was brewing in the Roman world. A civil war had erupted, and one name echoed across empires: Julius Caesar. Victorious and relentless, Caesar arrived in Egypt in pursuit of his rival, Pompey the Great. But what he found was something far more complicated. Egypt itself was in crisis. Cleopatra's younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, now ruled the throne, with powerful advisors manipulating him from the shadows. They saw Caesar as an opportunity and a threat. In a desperate attempt to gain favor, they made a brutal decision. Pompey was murdered. His severed head was presented to Caesar as a gift. But instead of gratitude, Caesar was disgusted. Rome did not reward treachery like this. And suddenly, Egypt's fragile political game turned into a dangerous gamble. Caesar chose to stay and intervene, and Cleopatra saw her chance. Legend tells us that under the cover of night, Cleopatra made one of the boldest moves in history, smuggled into the royal palace. Hidden inside a carpet or linen sack, she was carried past guards and enemies straight into Caesar's chambers. When the bundle was opened, out stepped a queen, not as a beggar, not as an exile, but as a ruler ready to reclaim what was hers. Cleopatra spoke with intelligence, confidence, and undeniable presence. She didn't beg Caesar for help. She convinced him. She offered him something far more valuable than gold: alliance, stability, and loyalty in a land Rome could not afford to lose. Caesar was captivated, and just like that, the balance of power shifted. War erupted in Alexandria. The city burned, chaos filled the streets, and the struggle for Egypt reached its peak. But with Caesar's forces backing her, Cleopatra's enemies began to fall. In the end, Ptolemy XIII was defeated, his rule washed away in the waters of the Nile River. Cleopatra had done the impossible. She returned from exile and reclaimed her throne. But victory came at a price, because now Cleopatra was no longer just the queen of Egypt. She was tied to Rome's most powerful man, and their alliance would change the course of history forever. The serpent had claimed her throne, but greater storms were still ahead. The throne was hers again. But for Cleopatra VII, ruling ancient Egypt was no longer just about power. It was about survival in a world dominated by Rome. And at the center of that world stood one man, Julius Caesar. What began as a political alliance soon turned into something far more powerful. Cleopatra and Caesar formed a bond that was as strategic as it was personal. Together, they became an unstoppable force. Her intelligence and charisma matched with his military genius and ambition. But this was no ordinary partnership. It was a flame that would reshape empires. Cleopatra traveled to Rome, not as a conquered queen, but as an honored guest. There, in the heart of the mighty republic, she lived in luxury, surrounded by whispers, envy, and suspicion. Romans watched her closely. To them, she was exotic, dangerous, and deeply influential. She was not just a queen. She was a symbol of the East, mysterious and powerful. And when Cleopatra gave birth to a son, Caesarion, everything changed. To Cleopatra, this child was more than an heir. He was the future, a living link between Egypt and Rome, a boy who could unite two worlds under one legacy. But in Rome, this was a problem. Caesar already had a political structure to maintain. Declaring Caesarion as his official heir would send shockwaves through the Republic. Enemies began to gather in the shadows, fearing that Caesar's growing power and his connection to Cleopatra was turning Rome into a monarchy. Tension filled the air, and then the unthinkable happened. On the Ides of March, 44 BC, inside the Senate, assassination of Julius Caesar unfolded in a storm of betrayal. Surrounded by men he once trusted, Caesar was stabbed again and again. The most powerful man in Rome was gone. For Cleopatra, the news was devastating. Her greatest ally, her protector, had fallen, and just like that, everything she had built began to crumble. Rome descended into chaos once more, as powerful figures fought for control. Cleopatra knew she could not stay. With her son in her arms and uncertainty closing in, she left Rome and returned to Egypt. But this time, she returned not as a lover, but as a mother, a ruler, and a woman who had learned that power could vanish in an instant. Still, Cleopatra was not finished, because in the rising storm of Rome's next chapter, another powerful figure was waiting, a man who would ignite a new passion, a new alliance, and a new war that would decide the fate of her empire. The flame had not died. It had only begun to burn brighter. The death of Julius Caesar left a power vacuum that shook Rome to its core. Alliances shattered. Enemies rose. And from the chaos, new rulers emerged, men hungry for control, determined to shape the future of the Roman world. Among them stood a bold and charismatic general, Mark Antony. For Cleopatra VII, this was not just another political shift. It was another moment of decision. She had lost Caesar, but she had not lost her ambition. Egypt still needed protection, and Rome still held the keys to her survival. So once again, Cleopatra made her move. She summoned Antony to meet her in the city of Tarsus. But this would be no ordinary meeting. No, this would be a spectacle the world would never forget. Cleopatra arrived not as a desperate queen, but as a goddess, sailing on a magnificent golden barge along the river, surrounded by music, perfume, and servants dressed like divine attendants. She presented herself as a living embodiment of beauty and power. The air was thick with incense, the waters shimmered with reflection, and Antony was captivated before she even spoke a word. This was not just diplomacy. This was strategy wrapped in enchantment. Antony, a man known for his strength and passion, found himself drawn to Cleopatra's intelligence, charm, and undeniable presence. Their connection was instant and powerful. Soon, what began as an alliance turned into a legendary romance. But their relationship was more than love. Together, Cleopatra and Antony built a powerful partnership. He provided military strength. She provided wealth, stability, and the resources of Egypt. Side by side, they began to shape a vision, one that rivaled even Rome itself. They had children together. They celebrated their union openly, and in a bold move that shocked the Roman world, Antony granted vast territories to Cleopatra and her children during a grand ceremony known as the Donations of Alexandria. To them, it was a declaration of power. To Rome, it was betrayal. Far away, another man watched with growing anger. Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, saw Antony's actions not as love, but as weakness. He believed Antony had fallen under Cleopatra's influence, placing Egypt above Rome itself. And he used that belief as a weapon. Propaganda spread across Rome. Cleopatra was painted as a dangerous seductress. Antony, a once great Roman, was portrayed as a man who had lost his loyalty. The stage was set. Two powers, two visions, one inevitable conflict. War was no longer a possibility. It was coming. And as Cleopatra and Antony stood united, believing their empire could rival the greatest forces on earth, they did not yet realize one truth. The world was about to decide their fate. And this time, not even love would be enough to save them. The storm had finally arrived. Two forces stood on the edge of destiny, one driven by ambition, the other by survival. On one side was Octavian, cold, calculating, and determined to rule Rome alone. On the other stood Mark Antony and Cleopatra VII, bound by love, power, and a dream of empire. There would be no compromise, only war. In 31 BC, their forces collided in one of the most active battles of the ancient world. The Battle of Actium. Ships filled the sea. Soldiers braced for impact. The fate of kingdoms rested on the waves. But something went wrong. Antony's fleet, though powerful, was outmaneuvered. Octavian's forces, led by the brilliant general Marcus Agrippa, executed a strategy that slowly tightened around them like a trap. And then, in the heat of battle, Cleopatra made a decision. Her ships turned. She retreated, seeing her fleet withdraw. Antony made a choice that would define his legacy forever. He followed her. In that moment, the battle was lost. What could have been a final stand became a devastating defeat. And with it, their dream of a powerful Eastern empire began to crumble. They fled back to Egypt. But Rome was relentless. Octavian advanced, closing in on Alexandria. There would be no escape this time. No alliances left to form. No armies left to command. Only the end remained. As defeat became inevitable, despair took hold. Antony, believing Cleopatra had betrayed him or was already dead, fell into hopelessness. In a tragic final act, he took his own life, dying in Cleopatra's arms after being brought to her. The great warrior was gone. Cleopatra, now alone, faced a fate worse than death. Octavian planned to take her to Rome, not as a queen, but as a prisoner. She would be paraded through the streets as a symbol of conquest. For Cleopatra, that was unacceptable. She had lived as a queen. She would not die in chains. In her final moments, Cleopatra chose her own ending. According to legend, she allowed an asp, a venomous serpent, to deliver a fatal bite. Others say it may have been poison, but the result was the same. The Queen of the Nile was gone. With her death, an era ended. Egypt, once a powerful and independent kingdom, fell under Roman control. The age of pharaohs faded into history, and new empire rose in its place. But Cleopatra's story did not die with her. She became a legend, a woman of intelligence, ambition, beauty, and power, a ruler who challenged Rome itself, a queen who lived boldly and chose her own fate in the end. Her rise was extraordinary, her fall unforgettable, and even today, her name still echoes through time. Cleopatra,